Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight, we journey to a city of marble and mist, where the sea whispers against ancient stone and faint salt air drifts through time. Beneath the surface of modern Alexandria, memories of ink and papyrus still seem to breathe, quiet as dust caught in a sunbeam. Here, scholars once dreamed of preserving everything humanity could know, a fragile hope written on paper and guarded by wind. So before the silence of night surrounds you, take a moment to like and subscribe, just if this brought you peace of mind. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. It's hard to imagine silence in a place that once held the thoughts of the ancient world. Yet, if you were to stand where the Library of Alexandria once rose, you'd mostly hear the faint rush of wind from the Mediterranean, maybe a few gulls, and the shuffle of traffic in the modern Egyptian city that carries its name. Long before it became a symbol of loss and mystery, the library was a very real, very ambitious project, one that tried to gather everything humanity knew and tuck it neatly under one roof. Like a cosmic filing cabinet, only without the folders or the cosmic part. The story begins in the 3rd century BCE, when Alexandria wasn't yet the faded grandeur we think of today. It was new, freshly built, marble bright, and aggressively proud of itself. Founded by Alexander the Great in 3031 BCE, the city was supposed to be his crowning achievement, a shining Greek outpost in Egypt. Alexander himself, of course, didn't stick around long enough to see it through. He died young, as conquerors often did, and his empire splintered into quarreling pieces faster than a clay pot dropped from a balcony. One of those pieces landed in the hands of Ptolemy, a Macedonian general who decided that if he couldn't be Alexander, he might as well run his own corner of the world. Under Ptolemy Isota, and later his son Ptolemy II Philadelphus, Alexandria grew into something spectacular. The Ptolemies were Greek kings ruling an Egyptian land, and they had a flair for cultural overcompensation. They wanted their city to outshine Athens in intellect, to eclipse Babylon in prestige, and to look so impressive that even Rome would feel a little self-conscious. To that end, they built the Great Library, a monumental institution attached to the Mazoj, or Temple of the Muses. The Muses in Greek myth were the goddesses of inspiration and learning, so dedicating the place to them was like naming your school after the entire pantheon of good ideas. No one knows exactly what the library looked like. Ancient writers were frustratingly vague on the details, which makes it all feel like trying to visualize a dream after waking. Most likely, it was a sprawling complex. Columns, shaded courtyards, lecture halls, maybe even gardens. Some believe it sat near the royal palace in the Bruchion district, close enough for kings to wander through its halls without breaking a sweat. Inside were scrolls, hundreds of thousands of them. If you believe the most generous accounts, estimates vary wildly, from 40,000 to over 500,000. Even if you cut the highest number in half, that's still a staggering amount of papyrus to dust. The library's mission was both simple and impossible: to collect every known text in existence. The Ptolemies were nothing if not ambitious. Ships entering the port of Alexandria were searched for scrolls. Any found were copied, and the originals, if we trust the old stories, were sometimes kept for the library, with the copies politely returned. Borrowing might be too gentle a word for it. The rulers also sent agents across the Mediterranean to buy or copy manuscripts wherever they could find them. They wanted Homer, yes, but also medical treatises from Egypt, astronomical charts from Babylon, philosophical dialogues from Athens, and records of foreign custom. If a civilization had ever written something down, Alexandria wanted a copy. The scholars who worked there were not librarians in the modern sense, checking out scrolls and stamping return dates. They were more like intellectual residents, mathematicians, poets, philosophers, geographers, living and working under royal patronage. Think of it as a mix between a university and a think tank, except with more linen robes and fewer PowerPoint slides. Figures like Euclid, who systematized geometry, and Eratosthenes, who measured the Earth's circumference with startling accuracy, are said to have worked there. Archimedes probably corresponded with its scholars, and even the physician Herophilus dissected human bodies in Alexandria, pushing medical understanding well beyond superstition. It must have been a place of endless chatter and rustling papyrus, of quiet debates echoing down long corridors. Scholars argued about grammar and the stars with equal passion, though in Greek fashion the debates may have included more hand gestures than actual yelling. The library wasn't about collecting knowledge, it was about refining it. Texts were compared, corrected, and catalogued. The scholars invented systems to organize and summarize works, creating the first known efforts at something like a universal bibliography. Imagine trying to keep track of 500,000 handwritten scrolls without an Excel sheet. But the dream of universal knowledge came with its own fragility. Papyrus, after all, doesn't age well. Alexandria's climate helped, but time, humidity, and human error were constant threats. The bigger danger, though, came from politics and war, those eternal enemies of libraries everywhere. The city's prime location on the Mediterranean made it a prize worth fighting over. As empires rose and fell, Alexandria found itself repeatedly caught between ambition and disaster. The first major blow, at least according to tradition, came in 48 BCE, during Julius Caesar's civil war against Pompey. Caesar chased his rival to Egypt, where he became entangled in the local power struggle between Cleopatra VII and her brother Ptolemy XIII. Cleopatra, as we know, had a certain talent for forming alliances, and Caesar's arrival sparked both romance and battle. During the fighting, part of Alexandria's harbor went up in flames. Literally, ancient accounts suggest that ships were set ablaze to block enemy fleets, and the fire spread to the docks and nearby buildings. Among those buildings, some say, was the Great Library. If that's true, then a portion of humanity's knowledge may have gone up in smoke that night. Later writers, like Plutarch, described it with quiet horror. Tens of thousands of scrolls destroyed. Others downplayed the event, or suggested that only a warehouse of books near the harbor burned, not the library itself. The evidence is thin, as ancient evidence tends to be, but whether it was that fire or a later one, the idea that Alexandria's treasure trove of knowledge could be undone so easily has haunted imaginations ever since. And yet, the library may have limped on. The Mauschan and other scholarly institutions likely continued for centuries, though diminished. The city remained a center of learning through Roman and even early Christian times. The scholar Claudius Ptolemy, who lived in the 2nd century CE, compiled his Almagest there, a vast synthesis of astronomical knowledge that would dominate the field for over 1,000 years. So perhaps the library's death wasn't a single moment of catastrophe, but a long, slow fading. In truth, the idea of one great fire wiping it all out might be too neat, too cinematic. The reality was probably less dramatic and somehow sadder. Gradual neglect, changing priorities, shifting empires. When Christianity became dominant in the later centuries of the Roman world, Pagan institutions, like the Mausion, fell out of favor. Alexandria saw riots, purges, and the closure of temples. Scholars fled or were silenced. By the time of the Arab conquest in the 7th century, the once great city was a shadow of itself. As centuries passed, the library's memory grew mythical. People began to speak of it as though it had been a single, sacred place, the lost heart of knowledge. Medieval scholars, Renaissance humanists, and even modern scientists have all mourned it in their own way. Carl Sagan once described it as the brain of the ancient world, which is about as poetic as science communication gets. But for those who lived closer to its time, it may have been just one of several institutions of learning distinguished more by ambition than by magic. Still, there's something haunting about its story. The idea that so much knowledge could vanish, that words' discoveries, entire languages could disappear, is a reminder of how fragile civilization can be. We often think of progress as permanent, but history likes to disagree. The loss of the library isn't just about burnt papyrus. It's about how memory itself can burn. Even now, we don't know exactly what was lost. Some say original plays of Sophocles. Others imagine forgotten mathematical works or treatises on medicine, astronomy, philosophy. The truth is, we can't know. That uncertainty is what makes the story linger, like an echo in an empty hall. Over time, the ruins of ancient Alexandria were built over, layer by layer, until the city we know today rose in their place. And though the original library vanished, its dream did. It's there in every archive, every university, every person who tries to preserve knowledge against the slow erosion of time. A dream of eternity, written ink that inevitably fades. Still, before that final fade, Alexandria's golden age had moments of almost impossible brilliance. Within its walls, thinkers like Eratosthenes had measured the earth with a stick, a shadow, and an angle of sunlight, accurate to within a few hundred miles. He also mapped the known world, introduced the concept of latitude and longitude, and ran the library itself. The man was basically a walking encyclopedia, except with fewer typos. Others, like Aristarchus of Samos, dared to suggest that the Earth might orbit the Sun, though that idea would take another 1,700 years to catch on. The scholars of Alexandria weren't just copying scrolls, they were building the foundations of how we think. They argued about atoms, dissected bodies to understand the human form, and catalogued plants and animals with a rigor that would make later scientists proud. And they did it all under oil lamps in a world without printing presses or digital backups. Every word was fragile, every discovery one accident away from oblivion. The city itself mirrored this tension between brilliance and decay. On one side, the glittering palaces of the Ptolemies. On the other, the hum of the harbor, filled with traders and sailors speaking dozens of languages. Alexandria was a crossroads of cultures: Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, Persian, and more. Its lighthouse, the Pharos, was one of the 7 wonders of the world, standing over 300 feet tall, guiding ships safely to port. But the same waters that brought knowledge and commerce also carried danger. The Mediterranean, like history, was rarely calm for long. And so, the library stood, or perhaps several libraries did, always in the path of history's storms. The scholars of Alexandria lived in a world that prized curiosity as much as conquest. While soldiers marched across continents, the thinkers of the Mausion waged quieter wars, wars of interpretation, translation, and definition. There was no fanfare, no battle cries, just the steady murmur of styluses scratching across papyrus and the faint scent of oil lamps burning into the night. They were fighting chaos with ink, trying to hold the world still long enough to understand it. The library wasn't a public place as we might imagine today. You couldn't just stroll in after lunch and browse the philosophy section. Access was largely limited to scholars supported by the Ptolemies, who treated the institution as both a monument to learning and a tool of prestige. Knowledge was power, and Alexandria's rulers wanted to make sure it was their power. Yet, in a strange way, that exclusivity gave the library its mystique. From across the ancient world, people imagined it as a glittering hive of intellect, a place where the secrets of the universe were quietly sorted into labeled shelves. The work of the scholars was painstaking. They edited and compared manuscripts, debating which versions of Homer or Hesiod were most authentic. In the process, they became the first textual critics, carefully analyzing variations in handwriting, dialect, and phrasing. Xenodotus, one of the earliest heads of the library, is said to have produced a definitive edition of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Callimachus, another scholar, created the Penarchus, an enormous catalogue that listed authors, works, and subjects, an early ancestor of the modern library catalogue. It reportedly spanned over 100 volumes, which probably made it as much of a headache to maintain as it sounds. Callimachus himself had a rather prickly reputation, even by ancient academic standards. He was a poet as well as a librarian, and he had strong opinions about literature. He preferred short, refined poems to long epics, which was ironic considering the size of his catalogue. But he embodied the spirit of the library, meticulous, cultured, slightly competitive. Alexandria wasn't just a place for preserving old texts. It was a workshop for refining thought. In those early centuries, the library was also a symbol of cultural synthesis. Greek scholars studied Egyptian medicine, Persian astronomy, and Indian mathematics. The Ptolemies encouraged this mix, partly out of curiosity, partly because it reinforced their image as rulers of a cosmopolitan empire. They presented themselves as heirs, not only to Greek civilization, but to every civilization they could claim under their influence. A sort of ancient branding exercise, really. Daily life in the Mausoleum was probably equal parts fascinating and dull. Scholars lived on stipends provided by the crown, which covered food, housing, and sometimes even tax exemptions. Meals were communal, and conversation likely veered from philosophical to petty, as academic meals tend to do. The residents conducted lectures, experiments, and endless discussions. It was a place where ideas drifted through the corridors like incense, sometimes brilliant, sometimes bewildering. Medicine, for instance, was both advanced and oddly experimental. Herophilus and Erasistratus, two early Alexandrian physicians, made pioneering studies of anatomy and physiology. They differentiated between nerves and blood vessels, identified the brain as the seat of intelligence, and described the pulse with surprising accuracy. There were even rumors, later and perhaps exaggerated, that they dissected human cadavers, possibly executed criminals, to learn how the body worked. Whether that's true or not, their research marked a sharp break from superstition. They treated the human form as a system, not a mystery, and that mindset quietly reshaped medicine for centuries. Then there was mathematics. Euclid, who may have worked or at least studied in Alexandria, wrote the Elements there around 300 BCE. It was a compilation of geometric knowledge so elegantly structured that it remained a standard textbook for over 2,000 years. The Elements became the blueprint for logical reasoning itself, its geometric proofs forming the skeleton of later scientific thought. When students complain about geometry homework today, they're indirectly cursing in Alexandria. Astronomy thrived too. Aristarchus proposed a heliocentric model of the cosmos, placing the sun at the center, long before Copernicus. His ideas were largely ignored at the time, but they show how freely the library scholars could imagine. Eratosthenes, the same man who calculated the Earth's circumference, also estimated the tilt of its axis, and developed a calendar with leap years. He was essentially building the framework of global science, one shadow at a time. And then there was geography. The library housed maps, travel logs, and merchant accounts from across the known worlds. Alexandria's position at the crossroads of trade made it a repository of global information. Ships from Carthage, Athens, Persia, and even India brought not just goods, but stories, descriptions of distant lands and strange customs that the scholars eagerly recorded. The resulting compilations were part fact, part fantasy, and entirely human. But for all its brilliance, Alexandria's intellectual empire was precarious. Knowledge depended on fragile materials, papyrus scrolls that could crumble, mold, or burn. The library's caretakers must have been perpetually anxious about the simplest disasters: a spilled oil lamp, a careless scribe, or an unexpected flood. Fire especially haunted the ancient world. Wooden buildings, open flames, and dry papyrus were a combustible combination. It's almost miraculous the library lasted as long as it did. Then there was politics, that eternal nemesis of scholars everywhere. The Ptolemies were as prone to intrigue as any dynasty. Brothers married sisters, alliances shifted, and coups simmered behind the marble facades. Even within the Mausoleum, rivalries festered. Scholars could be notoriously vain, and ancient academic feuds make modern ones look tame. There were arguments over authorship, interpretations, and naturally funding. Still, the library endured through the second and even third generations of Ptolemies. By the reign of Ptolemy III, Euclid, it was at its height. This Ptolemy reportedly borrowed official copies of Athenian tragedies from the city of Athens, works by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, on the condition that he provide a massive deposit to ensure their safe return. Athens got its deposit all right, but the Ptolemy decided to keep the originals and send back the copies instead. Scholars have called that the most expensive case of overdue books in history. By this time, the library had inspired spin-offs. The daughter library, as later sources called it, was established in the Serapeum, a temple dedicated to the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis. This second library may have served as a public or auxiliary collection, accessible to more people beyond the scholars of the Mausoleum. It suggests that Alexandria's thirst for knowledge wasn't confined to elites, though it always flowed through them. The scholars of Alexandria often found themselves walking a fine line between inquiry and impiety. Egypt was a land steeped in religious tradition, and though the Ptolemies styled themselves as pharaohs, their Greek intellectuals operated within a different framework of reason and debate. Sometimes, that gap caused tension. Ancient learning could be dangerous in its own quiet way. Too much questioning, after all, could sound like heresy. Still, the library remained a beacon. Travelers spoke of it with awe, and rulers from other lands sent gifts or requests. It was, in a sense, the ancient world's internet, a hub where knowledge was stored, indexed, and distributed, albeit much slower and with fewer cat memes. For a few shining centuries, humanity's collective curiosity had a home. Then came Rome. When the Romans arrived in Egypt, they found a city both splendid and slightly fraying. At the edges, The later Ptolemies had become more decadent, more entangled in palace politics, and less interested in the lofty ideals of their ancestors. Cleopatra II was perhaps the last flicker of that old brilliance, a ruler who understood both the spectacle of power and the symbolism of learning. She spoke multiple languages, studied science, and surrounded herself with scholars. When she met Julius Caesar, Alexandria was already teetering between glory and ruin. That's when the first great fire supposedly struck. Caesar's troops, trapped in the city during the Alexandrian War, set ships ablaze to block the enemy fleet. The fire spread from the docks to nearby warehouses, some of which, sources claim, held scrolls from the library. Ancient historians like Plutarch and Seneca mention the destruction of tens of thousands of books. Others, like Strabo, writing a few decades later, said the library still existed. Maybe both were right. The Mausian might have survived, but damaged. The scrolls might have burned, but not all of them. History is rarely as tidy as we'd like it to be. Even if Caesar's fire wasn't the final blow, it marked a turning point. The library would never fully recover. The Roman period brought new patrons and new problems. Rome valued knowledge, but it also valued control. The flow of ideas slowed, the funding shrank, and the spirit of open inquiry dimmed. Still, for a time, learning flickered on in the city by the sea. The scholars who remained must have felt the change in the air, the slow cooling of curiosity, the tightening of imperial oversight. Yet they kept working, copying, debating, preserving what they could. It's possible that many of the scrolls we lost were already beginning to fade from use by then, crumbling in their cubbyholes as new generations focused on new concerns. That's how knowledge dies, more often than not in a blaze, but in quiet neglect. And as centuries turned, the Library of Alexandria began to drift from memory into legend. By the time Alexandria had settled under Roman rule, the city was still bright, but not blazing. Its harbor remained busy, its streets still thrummed with merchants, philosophers, and gossip. Yet the edge of wonder had dulled. The library, or what remained of it, existed in fragments, like a mosaic with missing tiles. The Mausian continued, perhaps as a learned circle under royal or imperial patronage, but the great dream of gathering all human knowledge had already begun to dim. Rome, for all its admiration of Greek learning, wasn't a sentimental custodian. The Romans loved engineering, order, and law, but philosophy and science were decorative luxuries, admirable, but rarely essential. They preserved what was useful, borrowed what was impressive, and quietly ignored the rest. Alexandria's scholars still copied, compared, and debated, but fewer rulers were listening. The library, once a jewel of dynastic pride, had become an afterthought, a beautiful relic maintained by habit more than purpose. Still, even in decline, it produced glimmers of brilliance. In the 2nd century CE, the astronomer Claudius Ptolemy lived and worked in Alexandria, compiling the Almagest. It was a masterpiece of mathematical astronomy, defining the geocentric model that would dominate Western thought until Copernicus. His calculations were so precise, so obsessively detailed, that they outlived the empire that fostered them. If the library had fallen completely by his time, he must have worked from its surviving shadows, whatever manuscripts and instruments remained within reach. Alongside him, scholars like Galen, the physician, and Plotinus, the philosopher, carried on the Alexandrian habit of synthesis, gathering Greek, Egyptian, and Roman ideas into unified systems. They were the heirs of a place that refused to vanish, even as its walls cracked and its scrolls faded. But cities, like stars, die in stages. Alexandria's decline was less a collapse than a long exhalation. The Romans built new structures, absorbed its institutions, and repurposed its temples. Fires came and went, some accidental, some deliberate. One such fire, in the 3rd century CE, during Emperor Aurelian's campaign to recapture the city from Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, may have finished what Caesar's flames began. Aurelian's soldiers, retaking the city, reportedly destroyed the Bruttian district, the royal quarter where the Mausian likely stood. If any part of the great library had survived to that point, it probably perished there. The daughter library, at the Serapeum, might have endured longer. The temple itself was a marvel of Greco-Egyptian architecture, a symbol of cultural fusion. Its great statue of Serapis combined the Greek Zeus and Egyptian Osiris into a single calm deity, a metaphor perhaps for the library's own blending of civilizations. Within its halls, scholars and priests continued their work, but by the 4th century, the world around them had changed beyond recognition. Christianity had become the dominant religion of the empire, and pagan temples like the Serapeum became targets of suspicion. Then hostility. The library's scrolls, even if still intact, now carried the scent of an old order, the writings of philosophers and gods that no longer fit the empire's new faith. In 39 CE, Emperor Theodosius I issued edicts banning pagan worship. Riots broke out in Alexandria between Christians and the defenders of the Serapeum. The Patriarch Theophilus ordered the temple's destruction. Ancient accounts describe it as a violent, chaotic affair. Statues toppled, altars smashed, the temple stripped bare. The Serapeum was razed, and with it, whatever remained of the daughter library. If this was the end of the library, it wasn't a fiery finale, but a tragic misunderstanding. The Christians weren't out to erase knowledge. They were asserting dominance in a city built on old gods and older hierarchies. But the effect was the same. The scrolls, centuries of accumulated wisdom, vanished into dust and ash. It's easy to imagine the silence afterward. The courtyards empty, the scholars gone, the shelves bare. Perhaps a few papyrus fragments fluttered in the wind, only to be swept away. Alexandria still stood, but its intellectual soul had quietly departed. Yet, even after that, the city continued to pulse with memory. For centuries, Alexandrian knowledge lived on in copies, translations and adaptations. Greek texts had traveled far beyond Egypt, carried to Rome, to Constantinople, and later to Baghdad, where scholars of the Islamic Golden Age would preserve and expand upon them. In a strange way, the library didn't die, it diffused. Its spirit migrated into other languages, other lands. Still, people couldn't let the idea of its destruction go. The library became a kind of collective wound, a symbol of all the things we've lost to time. Medieval chroniclers embellished the story, blaming later conquerors for its demise. One tale, likely apocryphal, claimed that when the Muslim general Amr ibn al-As conquered Alexandria in 642 CE, the city still held a great library. According to the story, the Caliph Omar ordered its books destroyed, saying that if the writings agreed with the Quran, they were redundant, and if they disagreed, they were heretical. Historians have long since dismissed this as legend, written centuries after the fact, with little evidence to support it. By the 7th century, there likely wasn't much left to destroy, but the story endures because it fits the emotional truth. We can't accept that something so magnificent could simply fade away without a villain. Humans like tidy endings, and history rarely provides them. In reality, The library's disappearance was the result of countless small erasures, fires, neglect, looting, damp air, forgetfulness. A scroll misplaced here, a scholar exiled there, a copy that never got made. Over generations, knowledge doesn't have to be burned to be lost. It just has to be ignored. Still, the dream of the library lived on in whispers. The Renaissance, centuries later, would rediscover fragments of the ancient world, bits of Aristotle, Ptolemy, Euclid, and treat them like buried treasure. When scholars in Florence or Venice pored over Greek manuscripts, they were unknowingly channeling the spirit of Alexandria. The idea that all human knowledge could be gathered and shared remained irresistible. That dream has resurfaced again and again. Medieval monasteries tried to recreate it with scriptoria. Enlightenment thinkers built it into encyclopedias. Modern scientists transformed it into digital archives. In a sense, every attempt to organize knowledge from the shelves of a local library to the databases of the internet is a faint echo of Alexandria's ambition. And yet, the library's allure lies partly in its failure. The idea that knowledge can be complete is a beautiful delusion. Alexandria reached for everything and lost it all. Its story reminds us that wisdom isn't a finished structure, it's a fragile process, constantly rebuilt from fragments. Each generation rediscovers, revises, and reimagines the past, just as the Alexandrians once did. Sometimes, in quiet moments, it's easy to picture what the library must have been like before the end. The sun slanting through colonnades, dust motes floating like tiny planets in the air, scholars murmuring in Greek, Egyptian, and Hebrew, the faint scratch of styluses, the scent of ink and papyrus, shelves upon shelves of scrolls, histories, poems, star charts, philosophical arguments, recipes, medical treatises, all lined up like voices, waiting to be heard. A city of minds, contained within a city of stone. That image, more than any surviving ruin or text, is what keeps the library alive. We don't remember it for what it held, but for what it represented, a belief that human curiosity could outlast time. Even when the walls fell, that belief persisted, drifting outward like smoke into the centuries. Some modern historians think the real wonder isn't that the library was destroyed, but that it existed at all. That in a world of warlords and empires, someone thought it was worth gathering the world's wisdom under one roof. Maybe it was naive, maybe it was doomed, but it was also beautiful. And in its quiet, doomed way, it succeeded. Because here we are, 2,000 years later, still talking about it. As the centuries drifted onward, the memory of the Library of Alexandria became something different. Less a record of fact, more a story told to soothe our collective longing for permanence. People could not quite accept that something so vast, so full of meaning, had vanished quietly. The absence itself became the myth, and myths are rarely content with silence. By the Middle Ages, the library was no longer a real place in the imagination of scholars. It was a metaphor, an ache, a ghost of what learning could be. In monasteries scattered across Europe, monks copied what texts had survived the ancient world's unraveling. Each manuscript was a whisper from Alexandria, passed down through hands that would never see Egypt's light. The chain of copying was slow, uneven, and at times comically fragile. A single sleepy scribe could misread a letter and accidentally turn a star's name into a sheep's, and so whole constellations wandered off course for centuries. Still, those dim scriptoria, cold, candlelit, and smelling faintly of wax, were the closest things the library that the medieval world could manage. The dream persisted not because of marble halls or royal patrons, but because a few patient people kept writing. The idea that knowledge mattered survived the fall of empires, outlasting every ruler who had tried to own it. Centuries later, in the Arab world, a new age of curiosity rose. The scholars of Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo rediscovered the works that had once passed through Alexandria's hands. In the House of Wisdom, translators rendered Greek philosophy and science into Arabic, preserving and expanding upon them. They didn't think of themselves as rebuilding the library, but in many ways they were. They gathered books from India, Persia, Byzantium, works of mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and treated them with the same reverence the Ptolemies once had. Even the Renaissance humanists, those self-proclaimed heirs of antiquity, looked back at the library with a mixture of awe and guilt. To them, it represented both perfection and tragedy, a reminder that knowledge is mortal. Scholars like Petrarch and Erasmus imagined what it might have been like to walk among its scrolls. They mourned its loss, not because they needed another archive, but because it proved that even enlightenment could burn. The chain continued from Arabic into Latin, from parchment to print. By the time of the Renaissance, Europe awoke to find its libraries swelling with rediscovered wisdom. People spoke of the ancients as if they had just left the room. They marveled at how advanced the Greeks and Egyptians had been, never quite realizing that the very process of rediscovery was part of the same cycle Alexandria had begun, gathering, losing, finding again, and yet the absence only made it more powerful. The less that was known, the more the imagination could fill in. Romantic painters began depicting vast marble halls in ruin, scrolls spilling from broken shelves, sunlight cutting through dust-filled air. In those paintings, the library looked like a temple after the gods had left, a place where silence was its own kind of divinity. By the Enlightenment era, the library had become a moral lesson, a cautionary tale told in salons and lecture hall. Voltaire invoked it when mocking fanaticism, Diderot when praising the power of reason. Everyone, it seemed, wanted to borrow its ghost. It was the world's most famous ruin that no one could quite locate. Meanwhile, Alexandria itself lived on, a city of layers. The old harbor silted, the lighthouse fell, earthquakes shook its foundations. By the 19th century, archaeologists and adventurers arrived with spades and grand theories. They searched for the library's remains, eager to stand as the ancients had studied. But they found little. A few walls, fragments of statues, the odd inscription. The sands of Egypt had buried the dream so deeply that it seemed determined to stay hidden. And yet, there were quieter triumphs. The dream of collecting everything, though impossible, kept inspiring people. The creation of the British Library, the Library of Congress, and the digital archives of the late 20th century all owed something to that ancient ambition. Even the internet, with its chaotic sprawl and endless indexing, feels like an echo of Alexandria's grand design. A messy, self-replicating, uncontainable dream of total knowledge. In the 20th century, as wars burned through Europe again, the story of the library found fresh relevance. Scholars and writers spoke of it as a warning. Every time bombs fell near a museum, every time a library was looted, people invoked Alexandria's ghost. The Nazis' book burnings were described as a new version of its destruction. Later, When the National Library of Sarajevo went up in flames, the comparison returned again. The image of knowledge turning to smoke never lost its sting. The Victorians, predictably, loved that idea. They were obsessed with order, empire, and the cataloguing of everything: plants, fossils, moral virtues. To them, Alexandria was a mirror, the ultimate collection undone by chaos. Museums and archives in London, Paris, and Berlin became modern echoes of the library, filled with artifacts from everywhere else. Some of that collecting spirit was noble, some of it distinctly imperial, but behind both was the same impulse to gather the world into a single, comprehensible picture. Every era projects its own hopes and fears onto the library. For the ancients, it was pride. For the early Christians, it was temptation. For the Renaissance, it was loss. For us, it's nostalgia, a reminder of a time when knowledge still seemed like something you could collect, not just scroll through. We imagine shelves upon shelves of wisdom, neat and serene, even though the real library probably smelled like old reed, dust, and tired scholars. But there's something almost poetic about how the story turned out. Alexandria's library was built to hold everything, but what survived best were the stories about it. Its destruction became more enduring than its content. Like the ruins of Troy, its reality blurred into myth, and in doing so, it achieved a strange kind of immortality, and yet, it comforts us. We like to think that somewhere, in some form, that vast archive still exists, maybe in a cave, maybe beneath the sea, maybe in the quiet persistence of memory. Every time a new manuscript is found in a monastery, every time a fragment of an ancient text is deciphered, people whisper about Alexandria again. It's as if the library never truly left, it just learned to hide. In the early 21st century, Egypt built a new library on the shore where the old one may have stood. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina, a modern structure of glass and granite, its walls inscribed with scripts from dozens of languages. It stands as both tribute and continuation. It doesn't claim to replace the ancient library. It couldn't, but it carries the same heartbeat. Inside are millions of books, digital archives, and quiet rooms for study. The light from the Mediterranean still spills across its floors. It's as close to resurrection as history allows. Visitors describe a strange feeling there, not sadness exactly, but a kind of weight as if the air remembers. It's not hard to imagine that beneath the ground, beneath layers of stone and silt, the ghosts of scholars still drift between the shelves, murmuring to one another about the movement of stars, the rhythm of poetry, or the proper cataloguing of Aristotle's lesser works. Knowledge never truly dies. It seems. It just waits to be rediscovered by someone patient enough to look. So the library's afterlife continues, not in marble or papyrus, but in our imagination. It's the story of humanity's impossible optimism, our stubborn belief that the things we learn will outlast us. Maybe they never do. Maybe everything fades, as Alexandria did. But maybe, too, the act of trying the gathering, the copying, the quiet reading by lamplight is what keeps civilization from slipping entirely into darkness. The Library of Alexandria was built to collect the past, but what it really did was predict the future. Every generation since has been building some version of it, knowingly or not, adding new shelves, losing old ones, chasing the same dream of eternity written on fragile paper. No grand hall has emerged, no vault of scrolls miraculously sealed against 2,000 years of damp air. Just fragments, enough to prove that something vast once stood there, and that time, being the patient predator it is, devoured it piece by piece. Excavations around the ancient royal quarter have revealed underwater ruins, collapsed marble pillars, and steps leading nowhere, possibly part of the Bruchion where the library once stood. They lie beneath the harbour now, resting in silence under green water and drifting silt. The modern city of Alexandria hums with the noise of everyday life. Buses sighing, waves breaking softly against the seawall, vendors calling out from shaded stalls. Somewhere beneath those sounds, beneath layers of stone and salt and time, lie the faint remains of a world that once thought it could preserve eternity on papyrus. Archaeologists have spent decades sifting through that dust, searching for traces of the library, but what they found is more whisper than revelation. Columns, broken walls, bits of statue, and the occasional inscribed fragment that seems to hint at vanished grandeur. It's almost too fitting that the library would end up submerged. Water, after all, is both destroyer and preserver. It blurs edges, softens outlines, and hides things just enough to make them eternal. Divers who descend into those ruins describe the feeling as otherworldly. Columns shrouded in seagrass, fish weaving through broken statues. The ancient world doesn't crumble loudly, it simply sinks, as though it has grown tired of being remembered. And yet, people keep looking. They bring sonar, drones, excavation grids, and endless curiosity. The irony, of course, is that their efforts, these modern acts of rediscovery, are themselves part of the library's ongoing story. Every note taken, every fragment catalogued, every academic paper filed into digital archives becomes another layer in its reconstruction. Alexandria is not so much gone as it is constantly being rewritten. In quiet corners of museums, there are fragments of papyrus labeled from Egypt, provenance uncertain. Some of them may once have been read within the library's walls. A sentence here, a half-faded diagram there, a single leaf of a vast, vanished forest. Scholars study them under microscopes, scanning for traces of ink, the curve of an ancient hand. It's a humbling business, this archaeology of loss. Each tiny scrap represents a lifetime of work, a belief that writing something down could make it last forever. There's something oddly comforting in that. We often imagine loss as a clean break, a sudden vanishing, but more often, it's a slow diffusion, a seepage through time. The library didn't vanish in smoke. It dissolved into the bloodstream of civilization. Each time we open a book, compare an idea, or wonder about the shape of the earth, we're performing a ritual first practiced under the Alexandrian sun, and maybe it did, in a way. The texts that have survived, those copied by scribes, translated by monks, carried east and west by traders, are living fossils. They bear the fingerprints of the library's influence, even if they never physically passed through its halls. The structure of scholarship itself, the idea of cataloguing, referencing, cross-checking, descends from Alexandria's methods. Its scholars invented the very habits that modern academics now use to study them. That's history's quiet punchline. The library may be gone, but we still think the way it taught us to think. Even the act of mourning the library is a kind of homage. We've built it again and again in our imagines, each version shaped by what the builders needed it to be. To Renaissance thinkers, it was a symbol of rebirth. To romantic poets, a tragic ruin. To modern scholars, a symbol of resilience. The real library was probably smaller, messier, and full of arguments about shelving. But the imagined one, vast, serene, eternal, is the one that has lasted longest. The modern library hosts lectures, digitizes manuscripts, and serves as a hub for cultural exchange. Exactly what the ancient one once did. only with better lighting and fewer scroll fires. Somewhere in its archives, scholars pore over digital copies of texts that trace their lineage back to Greek originals that may, at one point, have passed through the old library's hands. The circle, incomplete but still turning, feels like a small victory. Inside, there's light, too much for secrecy, enough for contemplation. Rows of readers lean over books and screens, the faint hum of technology replacing the scratch of styluses. The architects built it to be earthquake-proof, fire-resistant, and flooded with natural light, lessons learned perhaps from history's tendency to erase what isn't protected. In the atrium, there's a plaque honoring the original library, though no one really knows where its stones once stood. The tribute is both honest and poetic. It admits that what was lost cannot be recovered, only reimagined. When the new Bibliotheca Alexandrina opened in 2002, it was more than a building. It was a gesture of reconciliation between memory and possibility. The structure's design, a great tilted disc facing the sea, resembles both a rising sun and an open eye. Its walls are engraved with characters from more than 100 scripts, a quiet declaration that language itself is the foundation of human continuity. Visitors describe walking into it as both humbling and strangely familiar, as if they've been there before, in a dream. In a way, the library's lesson was never about completeness, but humility. Knowledge expands faster than we can contain it, and trying to own it all is like trying to hold the sea in your hands. The Ptolemies built the library to prove their mastery over time, but what they created instead was a mirror, showing how fleeting mastery always is. Even their marble eventually crumbled, yet the idea they began, the pursuit of understanding, outlived them by millennia. Sometimes when historians speak of Alexandria, they sound almost wistful, as if describing a friend who died young but brilliantly. The city, with its mix of cultures and its restless curiosity, was a moment in human history when everything seemed possible. Science, philosophy, art, politics, all under one sky, trading ideas like merchants, trading spices. For a few centuries, the world believed that knowledge could conquer ignorance the way armies conquer land. Yet even now, there's melancholy in the idea of total knowledge. We've built databases so vast that no one can comprehend them. The dream that started in Alexandria to gather all that humanity knows has finally come true, and no one quite knows what to do with it. The internet is a strange descendant, chaotic, sprawling, full of brilliance and nonsense alike. Somewhere, Callimachus would probably be horrified at the lack of proper cataloguing. Eratosthenes might marvel at GPS and then politely request we stop using it to find sandwich shops. But even if they never surface, the dream already has. The Library of Alexandria exists wherever someone writes a thought down and trusts the future to read it, and maybe it did, for a while. Even after its fall, Alexandria left a pattern, a blueprint for how humanity learns: collect, compare, preserve, lose, rediscover, repeat. The process is endless and strangely comforting. Knowledge, it turns out, is more resilient than any building. It's tempting to imagine that somewhere, deep below the harbor, sealed in a forgotten chamber, a few scrolls might still survive, their papyrus fragile, the ink faint but legible. Perhaps one day they'll be found, and we'll hold them in our hands, realizing that we were never really searching for the words themselves, but for what they represented, the hope that something we create might last. When you look at the modern world, it's hard not to see the library's ghost flickering everywhere, in the glow of a computer screen. In a university lecture hall, at dusk, in the quiet, patient rhythm of fingers typing words that will drift into some digital archive. Every encyclopedia entry, every scanned manuscript, every shared dataset, each one is a small act of defiance against forgetting. We like to tell ourselves that we're smarter now, safer from loss, that our servers and cloud backups will outlast us. But the truth is, they're not so different from papyrus scrolls. They can vanish too, burned out by time, obsolescence, or a careless keystroke. The forms change, but the vulnerability stays the same. Maybe that's what makes the library's legend so haunting. It reminds us that all our knowledge rests on faith. Faith that the next person will keep the flame lit, that memory can survive its carriers. It's strange how a story can outlive its setting. The Library of Alexandria, as a building, as a physical thing, may have vanished 2,000 years ago, but its story hasn't gone anywhere. It lingers like the faint echo of a bell you can't quite stop hearing. Maybe that's because it was never just about books. It was about what those books meant. The stubborn belief that humans, fragile as we are, could leave something behind that mattered. And around them, Alexandria herself, the greatest port in the world, a mosaic of tongues and faces, Egyptians, Greeks, Syrians, Jews, Nubians, traders from faraway India, all colliding in a single, improbable city. It must have felt eternal then, a place that could never fall, never fade, but of course that's what every great city thinks, right before the tide turns. Sometimes it's tempting to imagine those scholars at work again. The morning sun rising over the harbor, the faint hiss of the tide, the shuffle of sandals along marble floors. A scribe bending over a scroll, blowing lightly to dry the ink. Another perched in a shaded corner, muttering lines of Homer to himself, trying to decide which version of a word the poet really meant. The sounds would have been soft but constant, like a city breathing through its thoughts. The dream of eternity, after all, isn't about immortality. It's about continuity. The scholars of Alexandria didn't think they could stop time. They just wanted to speak across it, to send messages to people they'd never meet. That's what writing does. It collapses centuries into seconds, lets the dead whisper into the ears of the living. Even now, when we read fragments of their work, Euclid's geometry, Eratosthenes' calculations, or lines of Greek poetry preserved by accident, we're hearing voices that once echoed through those vanished halls. The fall of the library wasn't just the loss of a building. It was a reminder that no structure, no empire can hold eternity. The Ptolemies built their monument to capture the world's wisdom, and in doing so proved how impossible that task really was. But failure doesn't make their dream foolish, it makes it beautiful. Because to chase eternity, knowing it can't be caught, that's the closest humans ever come to touching it. There's a quiet irony in how the library's destruction made it immortal. If it had survived, it might have been replaced, renovated, eventually forgotten, like so many other ancient buildings. But because it fell, it became legend, a perfect ruin, not of stone, but of memory. It left behind an empty space into which every generation could project its own longing for order, for meaning, for permanence. And so, the library became less a place and more a symbol for historians. It's a cautionary tale. For dreamers, it's a promise. Every burned manuscript, every lost archive, every vanished language carries a piece of it, and every rediscovery, every unearthed tablet, every restored codex is a small resurrection. That's the real power of Alexandria. Not that it existed, but that it refuses to stop existing in our minds. It's an unfinished sentence we keep trying to complete. If you stand by the harbor today, the air smells of salt and diesel, not ink and papyrus. The city hums with ordinary life, honking cars, laughing children, gulls circling above the Corniche. But when the evening light hits the water, something shifts. The line between present and past blurs, and you can almost imagine the masts of ancient ships on the horizon, their sails glowing orange in the sun. The same sea that once carried scrolls and scholars still laps against the shore. Time hasn't erased Alexandria, it's just layered over it, and maybe that's fitting. The library was always more about layering than permanence. Each text a commentary on another, each scholar building on the ones before. Knowledge, like sediment, accumulates over centuries, forming something richer than any single mind could hold. The Ptolemies wanted to preserve the world. What they actually did was teach it how to remember. There's a fragmentary beauty in that, a sense that eternity isn't a solid structure, but a pattern of echoes. The same impulse that drove a scribe in Alexandria to copy Homer drives a student today to annotate a PDF. The tools change, the hunger doesn't. We still crave to know, to preserve, to connect, to prove that our brief flicker of existence can leave a mark. If the library could speak now, it might tell us to stop mourning it, to stop imagining that knowledge ever truly dies. Every time we ask questions, we rebuild it a little. Every time we look something up, write something down, or pass on a story, we're restoring a single shelf. The library was never destroyed. Not really. It just changed form, the way fire changes wood into light. We often speak of the library in elegiac tones, as a loss we can never recover. But perhaps we've misunderstood the story. The library didn't vanish. It multiplied. It scattered across languages and continents, embedding itself in every archive, every classroom, every quiet reader tracing a line of text with their finger. The dream survived precisely because it couldn't stay in one place. And maybe that's how eternity works. Not as endlessness, but as renewal. The sea keeps lapping at the same shore. The wind still carries the scent of ink somewhere. And the human mind, stubborn, curious, and a little naive, keeps reaching for the same impossible goal to understand. So the story ends where it began, in a city by the sea, built by dreamers, lost to time, and reborn in memory. The Library of Alexandria burned, sank, faded, but the dream of gathering the world into words goes on, and perhaps that's the closest we'll ever come to forever.